Hello everyone. So, a new video today. So, an Egyptologist answers ancient Egyptian questions from Twitter. All right. I'd like to know some current Egyptian facts, but let's find out about the ancient Egyptians.
Laurel Bestock. Let's answer some questions from the internet. This is Egyptology support.
Okay. Laurel Bestock? That's an interesting name.
At FH Huntress asks, when did ancient Egypt begin exactly, according to you? Ancient Egypt's really old.
Yeah, no shit. It probably began around the time people got there.
We talk about when the first king of Egypt actually became king. We're talking about 3000 BC. And then we put ourselves on this timeline. That would be an even 5,000 years. So this then would be when we change from BC to AD. And we could say, Cleopatra is really close to that. So the pyramids at Giza are about 2400 BC. Not only are we closer in time to Cleopatra than Cleopatra is to the beginning of ancient Egyptian pharaonic history, there's even more time between Cleopatra and the pyramids than there is between Cleopatra and us. Ancient Egypt was already ancient in ancient Egypt.
Okay, well, the first king, okay, got this. She just re-explained it.
Atsunaze asks, seriously, how did the Sphinx's nose break? Our best evidence for how the nose of the Sphinx got broken comes from a 15th century Arabic historian.
No, like, if you're just looking at it, you can see why the nose would break. The nose is a piece that's hanging off, and it probably was the most difficult part to carve. So it's probably the weakest part of the structure. Everything else just kind of blends into each other, and it just kind of like you carved around it to create a shape. But the nose was I think it would be the most detailed part of it, and it would be the loosest part and the easiest part to break off.
And he explains that someone who was angry actually deliberately shot the nose off the Sphinx because he was upset that people—
What do you mean shot it? What do you... Is this person that told you this, are they like psychic? How did they know an angry person shot the thing?
People were revering this monument from ancient Egypt. This person was subsequently lynched by other local people who revered the Sphinx. So there are also stories that Napoleon's army shot the nose off the Sphinx. We think that one's probably not right, in part because we have drawings of the Sphinx from earlier than Napoleon's expedition, and the nose is already missing.
Obviously, it wasn't true. Shot it with what? Who's shooting at stone? I mean, why would they stop with just the nose? Lady, why would you even tell that story knowing it's ridiculous?
The Sphinx depicts the king Khafre. Khafre, a king of the 4th dynasty, built the second largest pyramid at Giza. At Silent Ushi asks, so what did ancient Egyptians talk like? Like, what did it sound like? Hieroglyphics ain't speech. We know a great deal about what Egyptian sounded like, in part because the last stage—
She's very expressive. The only part of her face I actually like is her eyes. The rest is,
Age of the ancient Egyptian language, Coptic, was both written in Greek letters, which we can still read, and in fact it's still the liturgical language of the Coptic Church. And so if you go watch The Mummy, you can hear much of what ancient Egypt sounded like. We are able to phonetically reconstruct what it sounded like. All mummy movies have somebody—
The Imhotep part, though, that sounded like English. I don't.
named Imhotep. Imhotep was the architect responsible for designing the first pyramid built in Egypt.
Like, imagine people are just speaking in like whisper, just like clicky sounds. Like it almost sounds like more than like Africanist or whatever that language name is. Kind of clicky, kind of subtle, and then they just say Imhotep in a clearly English accent. That doesn't compute.
At Wide Youth Styles asks, what are some ancient Egyptian medicine and tools they created that are used to this day? Ancient Egyptian medicine was pretty advanced. We know, for instance, that they performed surgery to relieve—
I don't like that. Like her eyebrows constantly jumping like that. It reminds me of what's the name of that guy? Asmongold. I can't watch. Like, I know he's very popular. I have no hate for people that that enjoys him, but I can't watch anything I can't. It's unwatchable. His eyebrow. He's just constantly, and then his responses are just like bland, and just like anybody could say that. He's like, what? Like, what the hell is this? It's unwatchable. And every time our eyebrows jumps like that, it just reminds me of that guy, and it's just like, it annoys me. Like Asmongold is whatever. I have no hate for him, but like, I cannot watch anything he's on. Like, I can't. It's just, I don't know, something about. I know exactly why I don't like him, but I don't want to put too much emphasis on it because it's not something he's doing personally. It's just like, he's just not entertaining to me. He's repulsive on every front. It's just visually, sound, everything, expression. It's just
pressure
repulsive.
on the brain. We have things, for instance, like pregnancy tests in ancient Egypt. A woman who wants to know if she's pregnant and wants to know what the sex of the baby will be should pee on both barley and wheat seeds. If she's pregnant, these are gonna sprout, and which one sprouts first is gonna tell her whether she's gonna have a girl or a boy. And modern tests on this have suggested that, in fact, the human growth hormone that is so increased in pregnant women does have an effect on the germination of grain. At P. Puffin.
Okay. That's a long time to wait to find out if you're pregnant.
Stuff asks, did ancient Egypt have bars in? No, ancient Egypt didn't have bars.
What was that word that was bleeped out? Was that an N-word?
Is so increased. It's like pregnancy tests in ancient Egypt. A woman who wants to know if she's pregnant and wants to know what the sex of the baby will be should pee on both barley and wheat seeds. If she's pregnant, these are gonna sprout. Increased.
What is happening?
But the above ground part. We know Puffin Stuff asks, did ancient Egypt have bars in?
Bars and. Huh. Maybe it says nightclubs? I don't know. Bars and clubs? I don't know.
No, ancient Egypt didn't have bars, but the Egyptians were definitely very social, and alcohol was part of their social lives.
Clubs.
We know that the Egyptians drank a ton of beer and quite a bit of wine as well. This was mostly done in homes and even in tombs. The underground part of the tomb might be where your burial chamber is, but the above ground part of the tomb is a party palace. There's a festival.
It's a hell of a way to party right above the dead. I mean, we should do that nowadays. You know, celebrate, and you get your relatives below you, holding you up.
Called the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, where the whole point was to
pour some out for your homies.
Get drunk in the tombs with your ancestors. In order to make beer and wine, we have large-scale breweries in towns from even before the first king of Egypt was present in 3000 BC. At Princesa de New York asks, watching this video in class about what did ancient Egypt look like, and I'm pretty sure it's just scene clips from Assassin's Creed Origins. So when we check out the Assassin's Creed Origins trailer, there's a lot in there that's accurate, from the landscape itself, this sort of green strip around the Nile, then cliffs and desert a little bit farther away. And the monuments are very accurately reconstructed. You can see the pyramid with a...
Okay. So it was a little bit more brown back in the day, before it dried and got all white.
A funny shaped top, that's what we call the bent pyramid at a site called Dashur. That pyramid is actually built by the father of Khufu, the guy who built the Great Pyramid. The reason that is bent is because this is very early in the history of constructing pyramids. They were still figuring out how to build perfect pyramids, and we think that this one cracked while it was under construction, and they changed the angle so that the weight at the top would not be as great. At Rednim asks, how did King Tut manage to be so popular even though he lived such a short life? King Tut is super popular with us because his tomb was found intact. The discovery of King Tut's tomb was one of the
I mean, that's the only reason he's popular? He didn't do anything in his life?
archaeological wonders of...
Oh, the I don't even know what kind of monkey is that. Is it a baboon? I don't know.
The world. If you go see this stuff in Cairo, it takes up so many rooms. You have chariots, you have shrines after shrines after shrines, nested shrines built around the body of the king, who's buried not just in one gold coffin, but in multiple gold coffins. The beautiful face mask.
That's a waste of gold. But gold is not really valuable except as currency, so.
Also in gold inlaid with precious stones that's on top of him. The King Tut wasn't that popular in ancient Egypt. He lived at a time that later Egyptians, in fact, wrote out of history. He was the successor.
They wrote him out of history. That's crazy. I mean, I would write a guy out of history too if he freaking forced us to build tombs and encased them in a bunch of gold. We could have been spending that gold. He was probably shitty on the economy. That's definitely an unpopular ruler right there.
Of a king who is sometimes referred to as the heretic king Akhenaten, who introduced a monotheistic religion in ancient Egypt.
Is he out of his mind? You come from all these gods and he was like, oh, well, there's one God. That's ridiculous. Of course there's many gods.
Tutankhamun was one of the kings who returned ancient Egypt to its original polytheistic religion and opened the temples again. The fact that he was short-lived, not well known in later Egypt, probably contributed to the fact that his tomb was preserved.
Yeah, and hey, imagine, if he took away women's rights by abolishing abortion or something. It's bad enough he was like, hey, there's only one God, but if he did that.
Thought to look for it. At KBronx2 asks, did you know that we can't recreate the Egyptian pyramids with modern day technology? Well, guess that means maybe we weren't the most advanced the human species has ever been. So we absolutely have the technology to recreate the pyramids. The tools that the Egyptians...
We're definitely the most advanced the human species have ever been. Why would anyone even argue that? It's like, oh, well, back in the day, they had more advanced technology. They're gone. That's not advancement. That's definitely regression. They could have the most advanced technology. They could go to all the planets in our solar system. Guess what? They're gone. Their technology is dirt now. They're not as advanced as us.
Egyptians were using to create these big stone blocks to make the pyramid were of two types. Rough stone balls of very hard stone, which dropped repeatedly, wear away the stone to do the major quarrying. The fine chiseling on these blocks is being done with copper tools. These copper tools would have required a huge workforce just to keep the copper tools sharp. So how do you get a straight vertical side on a piece of stone? Here you use gravity and a tool that engineers still use, a plumb bob, which is a weight on a string.
Plumb bob.
And with a
I've actually seen something like that. I just had no idea what it was for. I think I found it in the dirt.
Weighted string just hung. You just hold it in your hand. You know that that string is absolutely vertical. So if you're trying to get the side of a piece of stone vertical, you hold a plumb bob next to it and you just correct. You keep chiseling away at that stone until it is perfectly straight. So it would have taken decades to build the Great Pyramid at Giza. The stone was mostly quarried locally. You need the stones themselves to be squared and you need the ground to be level. How do you get the ground level? You carve a channel in the ground and fill it with water, and the water itself, again, gravity, will level, and you can...
That's what amazes me about ancient civilization. Imagine how ridiculous that was. Like, their economy is nowhere as advanced as ours. Their social dynamics is not as advanced as ours. But you took a bunch of laborers and people to build useless things. Just for years on end, they're not building more housing or anything like that. How does your economy support that? How does your people support that? How do you feed all these people? Like, that is insane. That is an insane thing to do at all. Like, they had to have basically majority of people in like poverty or slavery, because that is insane to even imagine them doing that. We're going to build the pyramids. What are you talking about? People are starving.
Mark that water level across your entire site. So in the end, it's not impossible technologically to build pyramids any longer. It's a social choice. We choose not to build pyramids any longer. It's not that we've lost the ability. At C. Vanford asks, who was the best pharaoh? Many people might say that Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, was the best.
Khufu. Okay, I thought she was sneezing.
Pharaoh, but my personal favorite pharaoh would probably be Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was a woman.
Of course it's going to be a woman. She's a feminist. Why are all these academics feminists? Hatshepsut. Okay.
She reigned as a king, not as a queen. That's not so much, we think, because she was trying to pretend that she was.
Yeah, but that's not impressive, really. It's not really impressive. She didn't conquer. She just got into office based on relationships. She probably reigned as a king because the former king didn't have any sons. It's not impressive. It's a vanity position, lady.
Was a man, as because this was a role usually played by men. In her inscriptions, for instance, she is still using feminine forms of the verbs, of words to refer to herself, but she's shown just like a male pharaoh. At Salma Khan asks, watching this show called Ancient Aliens on Netflix, yeah, so I can't sleep now. Why do the pyramids of Egypt match those in Mexico? The pyramids in Egypt don't actually match the pyramids in Mexico. They are different in substantial ways. The king is buried in a small chamber underneath the pyramid in Egypt. The pyramids, as you see them today, look like giant staircases. They're a little bit rough, and that's not how they would have looked anciently. So the final step in—
Yeah, but like, even if they did, the coincidence wouldn't mean anything. It would just a triangle would be a more convenient shape for people that are less advanced to think of to construct something. 3 sides, it's balanced. The bottom side is wider so that it can hold the weight of the top. It's an easily conceivable shape to build a structure that's going to hold up a massive amount of weight. It's coincidental. It doesn't mean anything.
Making a pyramid would have been to clad it in very fine limestone and then to shave the sides to make it perfectly smooth. So this would have been not something you could climb anciently. The pyramids in Mexico are not tombs at all. These are bases for temples, and the temples are approached by going up the pyramid. That said, why do they look similar? Why is this basic form of a pyramid found in multiple so different places of the ancient world? And there the answer is pretty simple, and it's that there's not that much you can build of that size without modern technology and without steel. So to get a really tall structure out of stone, it needs to be smaller at the top than it is at the bottom. So
Called it. And I don't even have a fancy degree.
there's not all that many things you can build that would get that tall using this technology. And that's really, we think, why we see what looks superficially similar in such different places in the ancient world. At Betchero asks, why did ancient Egypt fall? So the fall of ancient Egypt, from a royal perspective, when do there stop being kings of Egypt, is really when Egypt gets incorporated into the Roman Empire, when Cleopatra loses the throne. At Lambe Tur—
the Romans did their thing. They conquered, as they should. I've had this argument before with people. They're like, oh, why didn't Africa modernize like, the Europeans did? Because they didn't have any goddamn conquerors. They didn't. In order to get a bunch of separate tribes to form together to actually have an economy so you can actually have intellectuals, because they are supported on the backs of farmers and other people that can get food and build things. You can't have intellectuals without those people to begin with, and you need a much larger society that is outside of tribal units, which means you need conquerors in order for Africa to advance to the level that the Europeans did. And they didn't have enough conquerors to make it happen. People were still separated into tribes, and they were still just living off the land like a bunch of idiots. That's why Africa wasn't as advanced as the rest of the world.
Asks, did you know that Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, was actually Greek? Yes, I did know that Cleopatra of Egypt was actually Greek. She was the descendant of a Greek family that had been ruling Egypt for about 300 years when Alexander the Great in 332 BC conquered Egypt.
Exactly. Alexander the Great, a conqueror, created an empire. Talking about need conquerors. Nowadays, we don't need conquerors, but back in the day, you need conquerors, man. Like, conquerors get a bad name, but you can't be living in tribes and squalor, throwing spears at animals all the time. You need conquerors to bring all these goddamn people together under one identity and stop with the tribal stuff.
Egypt then became part of empires elsewhere in the Mediterranean. We don't actually know all that much about Cleopatra. We do know that she was bilingual and spoke both Egyptian and Greek. Cleopatra did hook up with Julius Caesar. She also had children with Mark Antony. She was definitely playing to...
This chick was banging everybody with status. What the hell's going on? She spoke both Egyptian and Greek. Cleopatra. Julius Caesar.
Keep her kingdom. At Paul, a long string of letters and numbers, asks, Egypt is overrated anyway, in my opinion. What did they invent that was so transformative on the modern world? We could talk, for instance, about the mobile writing platform of papyrus. We write on paper, which is a Chinese invention, but that writing should be done by a pen and that you should be able to send it somewhere easily. That is something the Egyptians absolutely pioneered. Ancient Egyptian mud brick architecture was so amazing that the ancient Egyptian word for brick has actually made it into English. That's our word adobe comes from the ancient Egyptian, ultimately acknowledging how excellent their architecture was.
Yeah, but we don't build shit out of bricks anymore, so it's pointless.
At AndyDoodle56 asks, will someone ever decipher
we do build things out of bricks, but not mud bricks. Will someone ever decipher this ancient language? Imagine the knowledge lost. It looks like a recipe.
This ancient language, imagine the knowledge lost. In fact, someone has deciphered ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and scholars can read virtually any inscription that we find. This is a very typical type of monument. And what we see here is a dead guy and his wife, and what they want is to receive offerings for the rest of their afterlife. And that's what the inscription tells us. So we read this, Hetep di Nesu, and NKN, for the Ka of Amenemhat, the name of this guy. So NKN Amenemhat Mes en Ep, for the Ka of Amenemhat, born of Ep, his father's name. At Roxy B1 1994 asks, does anybody know why the ancient Egyptians never painted people front on, but only sideways on? Let's take a look.
Because I guess they could tell a better story?
At an illustrated copy of the Book of the Dead. So they chose the most typical, the most perfect aspect of every part of the body. The person is shown in profile, so that you get the nose in profile, but the eye is always shown front on. Shoulders are always shown front on, even though the arms and legs are twisted in ways that are impossible. You can't actually walk like an Egyptian. In some ways, you can think of ancient Egyptian art like cubism. It's showing the same thing from different angles, from different perspectives. They wanted a picture of a person to capture the essence of that person in a way that was much more eternal. Their art deliberately did not look like anything you could see with your own eyes. It's more of a God's eye view. At Hajara Salis,
I think that's more interpretation. I think it's just more that they weren't that advanced and they just saw a piece of paper, a flat surface, and they wanted to translate as much of the dimension of the real world as they could. So the best way to do it is a side view of a person. If you show a front view, you're showing less of the body. With a side view, you get the skin, you kind of get the dimensions, the musculature. You get a lot more of the body from a side view than you would from a full frontal view.
Sue asks, why do Egyptians mummify their dead? What's the point of preserving the dead? And they did this because they believed that in the afterlife, people needed their body. They continued to eat and to drink to speak and breathe, and even to engage in social relations with the people they had known in life. Most people in ancient Egypt weren't mummified. It was an expensive process. In fact, it wasn't necessary in order for bodies to be preserved. The Egyptian desert itself does a great job of preserving bodies. But for those people who could afford mummification, cloth was really expensive in the ancient world. The linen that was used would have included oils and resins, and we also know that they used forms of salt that were naturally occurring in the desert to dry the body out. We know, for instance, that they would remove the internal organs. Internal organs are mushy. If you're gonna rot, it's gonna be because there's so much water in your internal organs. So you take those out and mummify them separately. In some periods, they were placed in jars. Oftentimes, the heart is protected by the placement of an amulet in the form of a heart that is placed over that part of the body. Ancient Egyptians.
How was the heart protected? That sounds like the heart was removed and replaced.
Didn't care that much about the brain, and often the brain was in fact removed from the skull cavity before a mummy was interred.
But they're removing internal organs. A brain is an internal organ. Why did you...
Miss Jenny asks, how did the ancient Egyptians get the brain out of the nose during embalming? So this big wet thing in your head that needs to come out during embalming could be extracted through the
back of the skull?
The nose. And we have metal hooks that we think were...
The nose?
Were used by jamming them up to break the nose bone, scramble the brain so that it's more or less liquid, and then with a combination of gravity and the hook on that metal, you pull it out through the nose. Because they thought the heart was the seat of intelligence, not the brain, removing it was a way to ensure that the head would be preserved. At Rafab asks, did ancient Egypt...
That is the stupidest... So they didn't want to remove the brain intact because they thought it was useless. How did they come to that conclusion? Did they never see people with brain damage? What is happening? How stupid could the... That is the dumbest thing. Why would you think the heart was the important bit and not the brain? That doesn't even make any sense. It's the most protected part.
Egypt have cookies. Ancient Egyptians had bread. They didn't have sugar. So their baked goods probably weren't sweet and delicious. Bread was the staple that was even used as wages, as a kind of money. So you would be paid in bread. And that was probably the majority of most people's diets. This is in fact a consolidated lump of the stratigraphic layers. This section represents...
Thought it was an iPhone for a second.
Probably between 30 and 50 years of living. You can see potsherds here. But when we get it under the microscope, we can also see things like the remains of the food. We have fish bones, we have tiny bits of grain, but we do know some about the legumes that they ate, things like lentils. We have onions and other vegetables that were eaten. Lettuce was considered to be an aphrodisiac in ancient Egypt. At She Wrote Birder asks, who the deciphered hieroglyphics and how did...
You know what? Now that they bleeped out that part, I think the other one was saying bars and shit. That's the word that was bleeped out. Who deciphered hieroglyphics and how did they do it?
They do it. Hieroglyphs were deciphered by a French scholar named Champollion. Champollion was one of a group of European scholars who was working on a document that had been discovered when Napoleon invaded Egypt in the late 18th century. The Rosetta Stone is a trilingual inscription from the Ptolemaic period, the late part of Egyptian history. It's basically a legal document about taxes and the temple. The top part of the inscription is in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the middle is in Demotic script. The bottom one is Greek. We've never lost the ability to read Greek. Now, it took more than 20 years after this was discovered for the decipherment to be finished. Now, Champollion was aided by the...
For what? Why would you write that small? Or maybe it's just printed small, but that's insane.
A guess that he had that when he saw little circles around a set of hieroglyphs in the hieroglyphic portion, that probably was a royal name. And the very first thing he could read was in fact the name of Cleopatra. Once Champollion was able to read the Rosetta Stone, this was really cracking the code of hieroglyphs, and this led to the ability to read increasingly large numbers of inscriptions. At George Stiles asks, have you ever read the Egyptian Book of the Dead? If so, what was interesting about it? We have read the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We have a piece of one copy here. This is just a chunk of it.
It's probably about their legends about the dead. It's nothing useful, just about their religion. Why does the dog look like that? Why is its back legs a pig?
Papyrus is many, many, many meters long. And so the part that we see illustrated here, in fact...
Yeah, like the front legs is like I don't even know what the hell that is. Some kind of wildebeest? The back legs is some sort of pig creature. The front is like alligator. Kind of bird head person. This is stupid.
Is what we call the weighing of the heart. This guy's heart is on a scale, and the gods are weighing his heart against a feather. If his heart is as light as a feather, then his heart is pure and it will not speak against him, and that means he can go into the afterlife. This very long scroll of the Book of the Dead would be rolled up and tucked between the legs of the dead guy in his tomb. So this was something that everybody who could afford one wanted a copy of, because it's spells that allow him to get into the afterlife and be successful there. That is like a cheat sheet for getting into the afterlife successfully.
Okay, so yeah, it's just got them their religion.
Just Talking To asks, what were ancient Egyptian scarabs actually used for? Most Egyptian scarabs were ring bezels, so they were on a piece of metal that would have been on a ring, and they had an inscribed bit on the flat bottom that was used as a seal. Seals like this. So a scarab beetle rolls a ball of dung up over a hill. The Egyptians associated that image with the rising sun, and they gave the scarab credit for bringing the sun into being. So in having a scarab...
Huh. That was dumb, but interesting.
As your seal, you are linking yourself to the rebirth of the sun every day. At Ducky Aisha asks, what's your favorite thing you've learned about women in ancient Egypt from your archaeological finds? Women in ancient Egypt had a status that was really rare in the ancient world. They could own things, own property. They could decide which of their children inherited their property. Men got off work when their women in their household had their periods. So when women had their period, they could expect that their husbands had to do the housework for them.
God damn it. Of course she would like that. Feminism, all throughout history, it's always just been ridiculous. The reason that women couldn't own property in America was because they could be saddled with debt and they could become a debt slave because of it. Women weren't saddled with such responsibilities in order to avoid the consequences that might happen to them if they fail to uphold those responsibilities. So it was an effort to protect women. Considering that a majority of them wasn't educated, they can easily be tricked and taken advantage of by financial institutions, hence why they didn't own property and such things. I mean, shit, even if they owned the property outright, they still had to pay some sort of property tax or something like that, and that leads them to a responsibility that could lead them into debt, and they could be taken advantage of because of it. Because obviously, you put a woman that's uneducated in a situation where she's not responsible for something and she's in debt, what's she gonna do? She's probably gonna, smash her way out of it. It's essentially have sex in order to, get out of that, which would just put her into a sort of sex slavery situation, and it's just not good. So that's why they couldn't own property, in order to protect them. Now they're free and they can own property, and it seems like a lot more women are starting to own houses than men, and guess what? More women are in debt than men. It illustrated the point as to why they couldn't own shit in the first place, because nowadays majority of the debt in the United States is held by women. That's why they did it. And now we see why.
At Black Jess Rabbit asks, I wonder what the ancient Egyptians' view on sex was. The ancient Egyptians really liked sex, and they were not prude
All people throughout all histories liked it.
about it, and they weren't shy about it. They actually did have a euphemism for to have sex. They would say to spend a pleasant day. It was just totally accepted that sex was a normal and enjoyable part of life, and it wasn't something that was stigmatized in the same way it has been in many other cultures. One way we can really see this, the ancient
The only reason it was stigmatized in other cultures is because it can lead to problems. For one instance, addiction. People can overindulge in that. Adultery. That could break down the foundation of relationships, hence break down the foundations of families. It can be problematic, and that everyone has the equal amount of self-control that can allow you to just freely have a society that's just sex positive.
Egyptian language did not have the word virgin. There was no idea that having sex changed your social position.
That is untrue. Instinctively, men prioritize virgins. So that is impossible, what you're saying. That doesn't make any sense because our biology has that foundation. So if you have a bunch of women that's just sleeping around, they're probably prostitutes. You're probably talking about the ancient Egyptians had an open society of prostitution. Married women, though, no. There ain't no way someone is have a wife and they're proud of their wife and she's just openly having sex with a bunch of people. That's not happening. So you're misrepresenting what actually ancient Egyptian society was like.
It was just something people didn't really like. At LX Yacht asks, don't Egyptian deities all have animal heads? Not all ancient Egyptian deities have animal heads, but many of them do. We have a bunch of gods here on this piece of the Book of the Dead. We have the god Horus, we can see here with a
It's like an owl or something?
falcon head, particularly associated with kingship. In the scene is Anubis, and he is shown with the jackal head that is typical of gods who are associated
Yeah, but who are the human-faced ones?
with cemeteries. We think that's in part because cemeteries in the desert are places where jackals actually would have roamed. At Maza Marwa asks, y'all, ancient Egypt is wild to me. How did they just discover a new queen and over 100 new mummies? From aerial photography to now really high-tech satellites, we're able to see from the air and see patterns of difference on the ground that can relate to things that are not visible when you walk on the ground. We use X-ray fluorescence, and we point an XRF X-ray fluorescence gun at a wall with pigments on it. We can get the chemical signature of the pigments. If they're using lapis as a pigment, lapis is the most pure blue pigment that's available. It's also really expensive, and the only ancient source for lapis is in what's modern Afghanistan. It's really far away. So questions about the interactions between Egypt and its broader world are new kinds of questions that technology opens up for us. We will not find another King Tut's tomb probably, but we have a ton left to uncover. So those are all the questions for today.
I guess we learned some stuff about ancient Egyptians. A lot of it seems very wrong to me, and it seems more of an interpretation depending on the person who is viewing it. But it was interesting nevertheless. Until next time.